She'ibili Nishmas, Rose Lemberger, Sarah Rachel Bas Hachaver Yaakov, Ella Gabe Etel Bas Chaim Yeshua, and is sponsored by Adina and Baruch Fischlowitz in memory of his father, Jacob Fischlowitz, Yaakov ben Baruch Tzvi, and Shama should have an aliyah. Now that the final moments of Shushan Purim Katan are waning and we're already well on our way to Purim, so I thought we would spend time discussing a comment of Chazal relevant to Purim that emerges from this week's Parsha. A very, very striking and perplexing comment. We all know that the Ramah brings a minhag not in Hilchos Purim, but something we know about from Hilchos Shavuos. The Ramah brings a minhag that there is a custom, at least in Ashkenaz, to spread out asavim, different types of grass, different types of greenery in the shul. Some Rishonim bring it in the shul, other Rishonim extend it to the home. We have flowers, grass, greenery. When it comes to Shavuos, we have it in the shul, we have it in the home, and the reason for that is, the Ramah says, because we want to remember the simcha of Matan Torah. Just like on Har Sinai there was greenery, so too we put the greenery in the shul. Where do we learn this from? How do we know that Har Sinai grew greenery? That is from this week's parsha. This week's parsha, the Torah tells us, Hagam hatzoin v'habakar al yero. So you see clearly that it was possible for the tzoin and bakar to pasture in the area that was Har Sinai. So it must have been that it had greenery. So from there we see that Har Sinai, from Matan Torah, grew all sorts of nice greenery. And because of that, the Ramah brings, from the Rishonim again, the Ramah brings that Zeicher l'simchas Matan Torah. This is why we have the custom of putting this greenery out, putting the flowers out when it comes to Shavuos. The lashon of the Maharil is Noyagin lahashtiach ritzbas beis hakneses b'besam shel asavim uveshoishanim, and with flowers l'simchas haregel, to express our simcha. The lashon of the Ramal is simchas yoy matan Torah seinu kabbalas ha-Torah. We all know that the Goyin took issue with this minhag, but this has been the minhag for quite some time, at least in Ashkenaz, and learned out from this week's parsha. And the question is, why is this the best way of expressing the simcha of Matan Torah? You want to express the simcha of Matan Torah, so the way that we do it is by illustrating that there was greenery on Har Sinai and that the animals could pasture there. But even further than that, the problem that I have is the comment of the Targum on Megillas Esther. The Targum on Megillas Esther writes the following. Targum says that Haman comes to Achashverosh and says, B'chodesh Sivan, I'm obviously reading a translation, B'chodesh Sivan, Oisim b'nei Yisrael yomtiv shnei yomim. The month of Sivan, Klal Yisrael make a yomtiv of 2 days, obviously referring to Shavuos. V'korim oisoi aitzeres oichag Shavuos, says Haman to Achashverosh. V'oilim al gag botei hakneses, they go on the roof of the Beis HaKnesses Shalem, umefazrim shoishanim v'tapuchim, and they spread out flowers and different types of fruit. Umekabtzin umelaktin osam, then they gather them together. Ve'oimrim, and they say, Kishem sha'onu mekabtzin umelaktim es ha-shoishanim v'tapuchim ha'ela, kach yiskabtzu v'yislaktu b'neihem mi b'neinu. Seemingly, an earlier variation of this minhag, Klal Yisrael and Shavuos would spread out all these types of greenery and different types of vegetation, and this would be the zechus that the Rebbeinu Shalom would look at for them to come out of the galus. Kishem sha'anu mikabtzin v'laktim es ha'shoishana v'atapuchim ha'elu kach yizkabtzu v'yislaktu b'nei mi b'neinu, bring us out Rebbeinu Shalom galus. And that is what Haman was telling to Achashverosh, right? Ein hadvarim oimrim ela darsheni. What does this have to do with Purim? This is for Shavuos. This is what Klal Yisrael, this was the zechus Klal Yisrael was banking on to be able to get out of Galus Bavel, to come back to Eretz Yisrael. So we have to take a step back and ask ourselves the following question. A beautiful minhag on Shavuos, to put out the greenery. But after all, where do we know that Har Sinai had greenery from? As I mentioned, the pasuk in this week's parsha. That pasuk is talking about when we got the Luchei Shniyos. When did we get the Luchei Shniyos? On Yom Kippur. So shouldn't the minhag be that we put out all sorts of nice greenery and flowers and everything on Yom Kippur? Why are we doing it on Shavuos? On Shavuos, the pasuk doesn't say anything of the sort. All we know is that there was greenery for the animals to pasture, for the animals to graze. When it came to Yom Kippur, when it came to Luchas Shnias, that's all the Torah tells us. So the Minhag Yisrael should have developed that on Yom Kippur we go about and we put out all these nice flowers. Imagine coming into the shul on Yom Kippur and there's beautiful flowers and asavim and what does this have to do with Shavuos? On the contrary, on Shavuos there's no mention of it. On Sivan there's no mention of it in the pasuk. Shouldn't that be the custom, that we do it specifically on Shavuos and not on Yom Kippur? I think the answer is as follows. If you take a look at the Gemara in Meseches Tainus, the Gemara tells us, Amr B'Shim ben Gamliel, L'hayu yamim tovim liYisrael k'chamisha asar ba'av u'kiyom HaKippurim. The happiest days in Klal Yisrael's calendar with Tu B'Av and Yom HaKippurim. Why Yom HaKippurim? Says the pasuk, Tzenu re'ena b'noi Tzion b'melech Shlomo b'itra sha'itra b'atar she'itra lo imoi b'yom chasunasai U'b'yoyim simchas liba. Yom HaKippurim is considered to be b'yoyim chasunasai u'b'yoyim simchas liba. He says, Rashi, why is Yom HaKippurim the day that we wed the Rabbeinu Shalom? Shenitnu b'y luchos ha'achroinos. On Yom Kippur, we got the luchos shniyos, our marriage to the Rabbeinu Shalom, the Yom Chasana and the Yom Simchas Libai, the Simcha aspect of Matan Torah, the Yom Chasana of aspect of Matan Torah, says the Gemara is referring to not to Shavuos, but is referring to specifically Yom HaKippurim. What emerges is, Rabbi say, what seems to me Chazal understood is as follows. Chazal are telling us that this mountain called Har Sinai, there are two ways to perceive this mountain. Klal Yisrael could choose to perceive it as Kof Aleim Har Gigis, as if they're forced into it, as it's a force. If we don't accept Torah, we have no choice. So, because if not, Sham Tehei Kvuraschem. They could view it as a Har Gigis hanging over their heads, or they could view it as a chasana, as a chuppah, as a place with simcha. What represents the simcha, the ava aspect? If Klal Yisrael would have accepted the Torah, b'simcha ba'ava, they would have viewed Har Sinai not as a Har Gigis, but they would have viewed it as a beautiful chasana. With beautiful, they would have seen the beautiful vegetation. They would have seen the beautiful growth. They would have said, oh, this is Yom Simchas Libo, this is Yom Chasunasa, this is a wedding. The way that Klal Yisrael chose to see Har Sinai was indicative of their Kabbalah HaTorah. And therefore, the Kabbalah HaTorah of Shavuos was a Kabbalah HaTorah without Ahava, without Simcha. It was a Kabbalah HaTorah of Kof Aleim Har Gigis. The Torah there never mentions the vegetation. It was there. Klal Yisrael didn't see it. They just saw frightening. We have to be Makabel. It wasn't until Yom HaKippurim where Klal Yisrael sees Yom Simchas Liboy, the Chasana. Now Har Sinai is no longer Kof Aleim Har Gigis. Now Har Sinai is a chasana. They see the beautiful greenery. They see the beautiful flowers. They see a beautiful chuppah. Then they're mekabel the Torah be'ava. They're mekabel the Torah be'simcha. Yom chasunasa, Yom simchas liba is referring to the luchos shniyos when Klal Yisrael were finally mekabel the Torah be'ava and be'simcha. But Rabbi say, we've been discussing for a few days already that when the Klal Yisrael were originally Kabbalah the Torah, there was no such thing as Torah Shebichsav and Torah Shebal Peh. It was all one. And therefore the Kabbalah that was Be'oines u'Be'ratzain, the Kabbalah of Kofam Leim Karki Gigis, was a Kabbalah Be'oines u'Be'oines, and it was a Kabbalah on the entirety of Torah. Torah Shebichsav and Torah Shebal Peh, says the Beis HaLevi, was all one. They weren't separate yet. It wasn't until the Cheda Egel, which likely was in the aftermath of the fact that they weren't mekabel be'ahava, they weren't mekabel be'ratzon, they were only mekabel be'oines, so then they err at the Cheda Egel. At that moment, the Torah is divided into Torah Shebichsav and Torah Shebal Peh. So on Yom HaKippurim, they come back and they see, oh, we want to be mekabel the Torah be'ratzon, be'simcha, Yom Chasunasa, Yom Simchas Libo, but it's only the Torah Shebichsav. They still have to be mashlim and be mekabel Torah Shebal Peh be'ratzon. When do they do that? Says the Gemara, this is what the Goyin means when the Goyin writes Yom Kippurim, quoting the Arizal. Yom Kippur is Yom Kippurim. That Purim is Mashlim Yom Kippur. Why? What's the connection between Purim and Yom Kippur? Because they're both Kabbalas HaTorah. Says the Goyin, they're Mashlim each other. It's not two separate Kabbalas HaTorah. They're Mashlim one big Kabbalas HaTorah. The Simcha of Purim is really the Simcha that's supposed to be on Yom Kippur. Why? Because Yom Kippur began the Kabbalah be'ava be'rotzei. Yom Simchas Liboy. Yom Chasunasai. But that was only on Torah Shebichsav. It wasn't complete until they were Mekabel be'ava be'rotzei. Torah Shebal Peh. Hoder v'kiblu b'mei Achashverosh. And that's why Klal Yisrael says Haman Tachashverosh. They were depending on this zechus of spreading out the greenery. Why do we spread out the greenery on Shavuos? Shouldn't we be doing it on Yom Kippur? After all, that was the day that we realized it. Klal Yisrael is being misaking for their ched. They realized that if originally they would have seen Har Sinai not as a Har Gigis, but they would have seen it as the Yom Chasunasa, Yom Simchas Libo, if they would have seen what the Rabbi had created, a beautiful Chuppa for them, so then they wouldn't have needed a ched ha'egel, they wouldn't have needed a luchos shniyas. If they would have seen the greenery originally on Shavuos and b'mekabel Torah, be'avol v'ratzon, originally they wouldn't have needed a luchos shniyas, and therefore we come every Shavuos and are misaking what could have been Klal Yisrael's original and only Kabbalas HaTorah, and we spread it out on Shavuos. And that's what the Targum says, that the Jewish people in the Golus Bavel, they were depending on this minhag to get out of Golus. They're depending on the minhag of spreading out asavim. What does that have to do with anything? They realized that the reason they're in Golus is because their Kabbalas HaTorah was lacking. Their Kabbalas HaTorah be'ahava was only in Torah Shebichsav. They still had to be Mekabel Torah Shebal Peh. And they're showing the Rebbeinu Shalom, we understand what our problem was. We understand we didn't see the beautiful grass. We didn't see Har Sinai as a chasana, as a chuppah. And therefore that minhag was showing the Rebbeinu Shalom that we want to be Mekabel the Torah Me'ava, which obviously they ended up succeeding in. Hoder kiblu b'mei Achashverosh. This is what the Targum means to tell us. Haman's telling Achashverosh that the Jewish people, if you don't get rid of them soon, they're going to get out of here. Because they realize that the reason that they're in this galus is because they're lacking in the Kabbalah's Torah Me'ava, B'simcha, B'ratzon. And that's why Haman says you got to act quickly. And Taka wasn't quick enough. The Rebbeinu Shalom says, I'm going to take you out. They were Mekabel Torah Shebal Peh. They were Mashlim, the Yom Kippur Kabbalah Me'ava, with the Purim of Torah Shebal Peh, the Kabbalah of Torah Shebal Peh Me'ava. And now we understand what the Ramah says. We spread out the grass on Shavuos. Why? Not just a zeicher for Matan Torah, a zeicher for the simcha of Matan Torah. Because the way that you know that Kabbalas HaTorah was besimcha and be'ava is if you saw a grass or you saw a har Gigis. So we spread out, and Shavuos says the Ramah to say that even though B'shas Mais at the time in Sivan, original Matan Torah, we saw a har Gigis, but now we know what we learned from our mistake. And Klal Yisrael now on Shavuos, we spread out the grass to say now we see really what was there. It wasn't a har Gigis, it was a beautiful chasana. It was a beautiful Yom Chasunasa, Yom Simchas Libo. It was a Kabbalah, it was a Nesinas Torah that could have been a wedding, and now we're Mekabel Be'ava V'Ratzon, wedding ourselves to the Rebbeinu Shalom.